Good afternoon and greetings, friends. What a great pleasure it is for me to be standing in front of you and have this long-awaited opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to a scholar par excellence, Dr. Rahul Verma. He needs no introduction. He has already made notable contributions in this area of research interest and specialization. As you all know that this is the second lecture under Thought Cafe. Now the very term Thought Cafe suggests that this is a space, this is a forum for critical reflections on issues of contemporary relevance. Thought Cafe works on intersections, as I've been able to gather from the insight of the committee members, thinking theoretically about some of these compelling empirical challenges, empirical questions. And it is our good fortune that we have Dr. Rahul Verma with us, who is going to focus on a very interesting topic, and that is political families and democracy in modern India. He is a fellow at the Center for Policy Research and visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University. He has a PhD in political science from University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include political representation, political parties, and voting behavior. He has numerous publications to his credit. I will mention just a couple. He co-authored with Pradeep Chibber a book titled Ideology and Identity, the Changing Party System of India. And he has co-edited with Sudha Pai and Shyam Babu a book titled Dalits in the New Millennium. So with just these few words of introduction, I would like to invite him to deliver his lecture, and I am really very grateful to Dr. Dhananjay Tripathi and other members of the organizing committee of Thought Cafe for giving me this great pleasure to chair this lecture by Dr. So, may I invite you, please?
Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi, for the kind introduction, and Professor Tripathi for inviting me here. It's a singular honor to be standing here and presenting my research. So what I'm going to do for next 30 to 35 minutes, I will present some book in progress, and I would really like your thoughts and feedback. But also at any point of time, if you have a question which needs clarification, please stop me. I'll be happy to answer that question. This book in some ways draws on my doctoral dissertation, and in some ways, what I'm going to talk here, of course, the focus at the moment is India, but it applies to other South Asian countries as well. What seems to be happening, why I think South Asia is distinct comparison to a couple of other democracies across the globe, is that political families are common phenomena everywhere. Right? If you go to US or UK or Iceland, you will find political families. But what seems to be happening in South Asia is that not only we have political families, but across South Asian countries, political parties are headed by families, which is sort of like distinct from other places. And so the reason why I'm interested in this topic is that I think there is a convergence happening in our political class, and that political class convergence is managed by rise of political families. So let me give you 6 facts about Indian politics, or 6 facts about India's political class. First, upper caste continues to dominate parliament and legislative assemblies. despite democratic upsurge of the 1990s, still more than 40% of parliamentarians continue to come from upper caste. 1 in 3 MP at the moment seem to have alleged criminal record. And if you look at the second graph, actually the number of MPs with criminal record and serious criminal record is going up. Third, median wealth of candidates and MPs are increasing. And it's increasing at a much faster pace than the pace with your and my incomes are increasing. Fourth, what seems to be happening that a large number of MPs are actually coming with business background. And fifth, a quarter of these sort of like politicians come from political families, and then there's a high turnover among political classes. Now, each of these 6 facts are known. I'm not telling you anything new. There are a lot of scholars who have been working on each of these themes, and we know something about them. But what I'm asking you to think is that these 6 facts are not separate facts. They are basically interconnected. Once you start thinking that members of political families, largely from upper caste, also have criminal background, then our sort of like political class looks very, very different. So the first argument or motivation for this project is that these facts or trends are not isolated events, but interconnected. And what this project is trying to do is understand reproduction of power, reproduction of political power in an area that is supposedly changing at a very, very fast pace. We just celebrated 75th year of Republic. We want to be third largest economy. By 2047, we have set some target for ourselves. If with all those changes, our political class remains very narrow, very few people can contest and win, and they are running the system, then there is something amiss in this republic. And so what I'm arguing that political families are at the intersection of this new class that seems to be emerging. And when we think of political families across South Asian context, we tend to think of the bigger names. If you are in India, you will think about Gandhis or Karunanidhis or the Mulayam Singh Yadav and Lalu Yadav family. If you are in Bangladesh, you will think about Sheikh Hasina family. If you are in Pakistan, you will think about Zardari family. What I'm basically saying, if you go below, you go to the district level, you will find actually competitive politics of democracy is a competition between political families. Much like the past, where kings used to fight kings, right now political families are fighting against political families for occupation of political power. And so this phenomena operates in a much, much cruder form, and I'll show you some evidence for what I'm arguing. And so, if you now, it's after lunchtime, so if you want to go for sleep for 30 minutes, in one slide, I'll give you what my question is, and answer is, and you can wake up after 25 minutes. Right? So the question is very simple. Why do some political families survive for a longer period? I'm not worried about that we have so many political families. But the question is, some families manage to survive for a longer period, and some families basically arrive and they finish. So why does this happen? And the argument, and in some ways I'm drawing from management, organizational behavior literature, is that families which manage to diversify themselves, right? If you are invested in the stock market, more diversification you have, more likely you are to make profit. So families that make more economic and political diversification are likely to survive for a longer period of time. And the reason why I want to focus on this is because so far the research is largely to understand where do you get political families and where you don't get political families. What it doesn't in that sense do is to understand the diversity within political family itself. We don't know how political families emerge, how they consolidate themselves in power, and how they decline, right? And so that's the sort of like motivation behind this project. And in some ways, if you travel in India or in any other South Asian country, I think you will be able to piece a picture of what political families look like. So, very sort of like empirical definition is at least 2 members in active politics, and they are related either by blood or marriage, right? So, very sort of like operationalization of that definition. But if I have to give a caricature of the political family, most political families in India are likely to come from the dominant caste, right? And they occupy multiple political offices within themselves. So So you will see someone contesting MLA, someone contesting MP, someone contesting even panchayat election. Within the family, they will occupy multiple positions. They invest themselves heavily in rent-free sectors. So if you are in UP, they are going to own petrol pumps of that area. Most of the private colleges are now run by political families across the country. So of what's happening to our education sector. If you are in Karnataka, they will own mining businesses. If you are in Maharashtra, they will control sugar sort of like factories, right? So depending upon the local political economy, these families occupy central role in the economic pipelines of the region. They oversee a large patronage network, and in that sense, they have linkages with criminal entrepreneurs of their areas, control local bureaucrats, and do a lot of other things. In some ways, political families, if you are ever interested, think of graduation from Godfather 1 to Godfather 2. This is what actually happens in real life. They will start small and slowly they will build an empire for themselves. So the book has multiple things going on, but I'm going to focus on a very small part of it, where now I have been able to collect the data set on global heads of the state. So there was already a deep state leaders database from 1945 to 2015. All I did with help of a couple of students, where I have been able to know whether the head of the state, meaning either the president or the prime minister, came from a political family or started a political family, and I'm happy to show you some hints on that. But there are, like, at the moment, I'm going to just present the theory, some context, how I collected the data, and then how families look like, some empirical analysis and case studies, and finally I'll talk about the implications of this project. And so, theory is very simple, which is that families that manage to diversify their economic resources and political position, they are likely to survive longer in politics. How does that happen? Once you do diversification, you are able to access and control many local political economy networks. Right? If you are running colleges, if you are running sort of like big construction projects, you are controlling very different kind of sort of like networks. And so I won't go more in theory, but I'm happy to talk more about it. Why is diversification so important? Diversification is important because one, it allows you to sort of like take advantage of changing circumstances. Right? Both if there are negative shocks to the system or positive shocks to the system. If you have diversified yourself, you are able to take advantages of some of those things. So political diversification is that you contest multiple positions, different kinds of things. You occupy some position within the party organization, and whether you manage to become a member of the executive, meaning some ministerial post or something like that. Economic diversification is when you put your resources in very different kind of things. So most of those resources are put in rent-free sectors. But by rent-free sectors, I mean sectors which are cash rich, right? So they are not going to run a showroom where they are selling bikes or cars. They are much more likely to run, as I said, petrol pumps, or they will have PWD construction kind of activities where there is a lot of cash inflow that takes place. And I'm also sort of like having a caveat here that this diversification is not like, they're sitting in a boardroom meeting and deciding how the portfolio allocation will happen. Some of those could just be by chance, right? You did something and it could be sort of like, right. So it's a happenstance rather than that there is intentional doing of why. Okay, so what is the data and for this argument? So I collected data on familial connections between politicians in Uttar Pradesh, one of the largest states in the country, between 1974 and 2019. So 50-year data. And this is a 5 decades, so I know when politicians are entering or exiting the system, and there's a time variant component, so I can test multiple things. So in some ways, I have information on more than 19,000 candidates who contested UP, SMP or MP election in this time period. And at the moment, what I'm going to show you is based on data of 11,500. So I'm not looking at local body elections, just focusing on general election G, and A is the assembly election. And the reason I chose UP, one, because it's largest state in terms of population and state members of the parliament, but now I also have data across the country for since 1989, and UP seems to be like a typical case. So there are states, some states like Punjab have a very high dynastic representation, and there are states like Tamil Nadu which have no dynastic representation, right? Why this should be the case, that's a different matter. It's a very different kind of political argument. But what we find that UP is somewhere in the middle, and the period which I'm looking is very, very competitive. You saw many parties coming in and going out of power, which means that for any family to survive, it would be very, very difficult. Right? So the question is, how do I know the data on these 11,000 candidates over 15 years? So when you do research, you have to be learned. Like at 4 years, also you do the same thing. And sometimes you get lucky. So how did I get lucky? Is in 2015, after the Panchayat election, UP State Election Commission uploaded the results of the Panchayat election. And in their sort of like enthusiasm, they uploaded the phone number of every person who has contested Panchayat election. Right? So UP has some 56,000 Panchayats. On an average, 5 people contested in Panchayat members. So I have now database of 2,50,000 Panchayat candidates. And so I got 4 undergraduate students from Delhi University. I gave them SIM cards, and for a year I ran a call center. I sent all these people and asked them about their MLAs and people who have sort of like contested. Right? So that's the way of information generation. But I wasn't very sure whether like this alone is a good data source to gather information. So one day in Lucknow, I was eating kebabs. And while eating kebabs, I noticed UP Press Club office. And so I went there and I asked them, do you have a directory of journalists who are your members? They said, yes, but it will cost you 100 rupees. I said, okay, take 200 rupees. So now I also have a database of all journalists, which by district, not by district, by tehsil, which organization they belong to and what is their phone number. And so through these two data sources, I was able to triangulate information on each candidate who has contested. I had some coding rules that you should at least talk to 3 people before saying that I know about the Ranjit Tripathi, which family he comes from. Right? So that was the way how this database was built. And so once I had database, I can now do all kinds of statistical analysis. The first map actually just shows you the number of political families that are present in any district. And what I find that yes, there is variation. Some districts have more, some districts less. But political families are present across the state. What I also find, most political families are founded by a male politician. Very few are female-founded political families. I also can know the combination. So mostly it's a father-son combination, followed by brothers, and then followed by wives. Daughters and daughter-in-law account for less than 1/10 of the entire sort of like political family. So I have been between this period of 1974 and 2019, I find in my data set that in UP there were 322 political families that contested. And I know this is an underreported number. Right? There were many more political families, but now I know that there are 322 political families which had at least 2 members contesting at A and G level. Right? So that's what the data set looks like. And then I try to go, okay, which party is much more likely to feel very like the expectations are that parties which are organizationally superior will place lesser sort of like dynastic candidates, and I find a similar thing that BJP and BSP is likely to place lesser dynastic candidates compared to the Samajwadi Party and Congress. I also try to look at the caste composition of these political families. I'm going over this data a little quickly, but please feel free to stop me and what I find that while upper caste are just 18% of the population, among the political families, they are almost 40%. Dalits, who account for 22% of the population, and because of reservation, they also have 22% of the share among MLAs. The number of political families among them is really low. So what this tells you that while there is a lot of things changing about sort of like lower caste assertion and those kind of things, political families are much more likely to come from the dominant communities. And if you come from a lower caste or a lower caste politician, your chances of a political family formation is relatively lower. What do these political families do? One, they start with higher land ownership, right? They have greater amount of land, and once they are in politics, they try to build reputation. So most of these political family members are more likely to own schools and colleges in their areas. But my interest was to figure out why some families, if you remember the question, survive for a longer period of time and others take life. Long back, there was a famous political economist who said 200 years back, he talked about circulation of things. And so I wanted to do this kind of analysis for political families. And I found that among these 322 families, there are one third of the families which continue to have presence, meaning for 50 years, there are 24% families which continue to be in power. There are 28% of the families which have declined, meaning they were in power in 60s, 70s, 80s, but no longer anyone contests, or when they contest, they move away. And then there are 28% families which actually became families in last 15, 20 years. So my first thing was to look at the difference between these kind of families. What I find that the maximum decline is actually happening among upper caste, and the maximum rise seems to be happening around OBCs and Dalits, right? Which gels well with the story of democratic upsurge, right? That lower caste politicians are also able to now act in similar ways as sort of like the upper caste families. So you have started seeing political family formations among these families. But how are these families diversifying themselves? So those families which have higher, like contesting at multiple levels, those families which are holding party organization positions and ministerial positions are much more likely to remain stable, and those who didn't, they are much likely to decline. And same thing is happening in terms of economic diversification. So I collected information on whether they own petrol pump, whether they have some investment in construction and transport. In UP rural area, you will see a lot of politicians having brick and those kind of activities. I'm more sort of like happy to give you Q&A, go more into detail. Some of this data I understand is sketchy, but this gives us a good picture of what might be happening. Now here is the key sort of like results of the environment. So what I'm doing here, and some of this is a little bit sort of like quantitative statistical exercise, but let me give you a more sort of like perspective on what is happening. If you look at the first graph, I'm actually plotting survival probabilities. Survival probability is that you start at 100%, and then with every year, your survival is going to decline. This is the same model insurance agencies, right? You go and tell them, I am 34-year-old, I want insurance for 50 years. Your premium is calculated based on your year and how many diseases you likely to have. And they're calculating when are you going to die. Right? That's how they calculate your premium. Like older you are, your premium is going to be high, right? And so this is what I'm doing here. I'm saying, okay, now I have information on 322 political families. Tell me how likely they are going to survive. And so if you look at the first graph, it basically tells you that by year 10, 20% or 25% of the families decline, meaning only 75 years are left. By year 20, 50% of the families have gone back, right? So average families actually, the average political families survive in power for 20 to 22 years, right? So that's what it is. The second graph, what I'm doing is basically I'm saying, okay, now give me the survival probabilities of families that had high diversification versus low diversification. And you see that there is a divergence. High diversification is plotted with slightly solid line, and low diversification with slightly beige line. And you see there is a divergence. Those who have diversified more, they are likely to survive for some longer years. And then I did some regression analysis to show, okay, whatever the results that I have got is statistically robust. But I also know the data story in itself is not complete to tell you what's happening. And so I did some sort of like very deep field work to understand how these families survive. So there is a district in UP, Saharanpur, which borders Uttarakhand. And I spent a lot, like I traveled to that district many times, and I found that there were two families which actually started their politics before independence. They were part of district election boards in 1920s. The, the first kind of family members, one is a Masood family. The current entry from Saharanpur, Imran Masood, comes from this family. His great grandfather was an MLA in 1950. His uncle was member of Lok Sabha for 6-7 terms. He, in fact, was a contestant for vice president election. He was the first one who got rejected. Like something happened, which is basically he was debarred because there was a criminal offense proven against Rashid Masood. So he comes from the Rashid Masood family. And Rashid Masood family has been in politics for 50 or 60 odd years. And then the other family is Chaudhary family. Their family, like the first two elections in 1950, they won when Masood family actually lost. And in the last 20 years, the Chaudhary family has not been able to win any election, though they continue to get ticket nomination. So I want you to understand why Masood family remains influential and Chaudhary family decline. Because there was no, both these families are landlords of their areas. They started politics in 50s. They are not just landlords, they are sort of community leaders. They are other like Chaudhary families actually Chaudhary of their subcaste within the butchers. And this family, Masoods are leaders of Muslims not just in their district but across Western UP. They tell that kind of way. So the idea was to understand what did Masoods do right. So they continue to be in power, and Chaudharys for 20 odd years have not been able to be there. And so something happened. In the 1980s or 90s, Masood family decided we should also have a house in the district headquarters. So they moved, like they have, both of them had the same assembly constituency. They just built a house in district headquarters. Now think of what was happening in the 90s of India. There was construction boom. Everywhere things were being built. Once you are a politician, you are around the construction sector, you now have much more resources to extract from. And once you are extracting resources by late 1995, panchayat elections and municipal elections also start happening. So even Masoods had a difficult time. In the 90s, Masoods also started losing election. But Imran Masood then contests the Saharan municipal corporation election and becomes a politician. And so for him, both they were able to diversify politically, not just contesting MP, but Saharanpur district sort of municipal corporation, and also got a rent source, which is basically in the city from construction kind of operations they were getting more. Chaudharys continue to remain in their rural area, in their village. Much of their rent was actually coming from sugarcane factories. Saharanpur is in the sugarcane belt. There were a lot of sugar factories, 7 at that point of time. But by late 90s, what starts happening is that these sugar factories which were in public sector or cooperative sector, they got privatized. And once these companies became or factories became privatized, Chaudharys lost their source of sort of like rent extraction. And they were also losing, in that sense, politically, Ram Mandir Andolan and all those kind of things. And so, if you trace the story, you find that something Muslims did which happened by chance right for them. And these families were not able to diversify their rent resources or income resources, and they continue to face challenges. Now, this story of UP is also happening in all other sort of like parts of the country. So, I want you to see another state and what's happening. I recently published this paper on Kolhapur in Maharashtra. There are intellectual reasons why I did it, but just to give you a snapshot of what's happening in Kolhapur. At the moment, in 2024 election in Maharashtra, in Kolhapur, there are 16 political families. Out of them, 14 families have direct linkages with cooperative institutions, either district cooperative bank or sugar cooperatives or something else. The 15th family is the royal family of Kolhapur, and there is one other family. Right? So without cooperatives, it's hard for you to sort of like survive in Kolhapur. 12 out of 16 families are Marathas, and 7 of the 16 families now have their 3rd generation in politics. In Kolhapur, you have 10 assembly constituencies, In 5 assembly constituencies, the winner and runner-up both were from political families, and in 3 other, either the winner or the runner-up was from a political family. So look at the kind of competition you are seeing in this kind of little part. And a very similar story plays out in Kolhapur between these two families. One is the Gayakwad. Gayakwad in the 1980s was known as King of Kolhapur. He was 5-time MP. Now his sort of like family doesn't even, like this election, they didn't even get the ticket to contest. Whereas Awadis are families which start in 60s and 70s, and now they have like third generation active politics, right? So the story which I told you from you is happening in other parts of the country in multiple ways. So just to now conclude, this project in some ways focuses on the Masoods and Chaudhurys and Awadis and Gayakwats, right? I want to understand what's happening on the ground and what kind of control these families have. To me, these families control the apex of power at the local level. We focus too much on the top families while they are important. Below district level, this is the sort of like thing that's happening. And the reason I'm sort of like concerned about the rise of this kind of politics is that it has serious consequences, not just normative, but empirically, if members of political families are contesting, meaning the door is closed for common citizens to become part of the electoral process, right? In some ways, our chances of basically getting nomination for a party is in some ways sort of like low, because at the end of the day, what seems to be happening, the political parties, which we assume are going to serve as conduit between citizens and the state, they're actually at the local level working under the organized interest of these families. In some ways, parties are becoming instrument of extension of family power or introduction of family power. Second, the family politics of networks of power cannot sort of like exist without controlling other arms of the state. And so what you see that state resources are then in some ways get directed in reproduction of this power rather than just in welfare at large. So in that sense, if families are controlling sort of like power politics at the local level, then this is going to have a serious consequence both on our democracy project as well as on our governance project, which we hope will take us to a brighter day. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for patiently listening.
Sometimes when we look at the story called political, we look at number of dots. We tend to focus more on the higher side of the scale. We tend to take a macro view of the reality. But at the micro level, what is going on sometimes does not catch our attention. And given the fact that we all are political in the sense that day in and day out, we are very much a part of the system as citizens, as common people. Sometimes we really do not know in what ways we are being impacted by these forces and transformations. So I think your call, although I have my areas more in international relations and geopolitics, but I have always been intrigued by the phenomenon which I have called micro geopolitics. So instead of focusing on the planning systems and reactions. This morning we were talking about security studies now, about how resources are unequally distributed. And then there's a question of access to resources, control over those resources, and denial of those resources. So that micro assertion become very, very important. I don't want to say more because I know this thoughtful and thoughtful presentation will demand and deserve questions from all of you. So the floor is open. Try to be as concise as possible so that we can take the questions. So I will go from this side and then come to this side. Rest assured we will have everyone.
start with people. Just in the alternate which I saw, don't practice. We can connect with the questions. So my question is regarding somewhat of the methodology, because when you talk about the diversification, very political families, how do you perceive members within a set family or from different political parties? And the second part of it is that are you assuming that when such kind of events happening, when multiple members are competing from the different political parties, it is necessarily adversary, like in the case of ours, or is it something which is mutually?
Interesting talk about back in the day when I was working in Gandhi, so back when I was working on the structure in India, what I saw is that politicians were using their patronage, they especially these people in, let us say, government jobs now, and then they will be writing sort of patronage to that and then winning elections, especially in the smaller constituencies where like small elections are small, so vote want to make the matter. So how do you like see this neo-patrimonial structure playing out in India, where actually the expertise is quite large, and since you work on the play, then you talk about patronage system. So how does it play out in, let's say, like consolidation or in production?
Thank you, Professor. Based on your presentation, I think there is a logical extension that you made, or that I made in my head. So when you talk about the possibility of a political family surviving, dependent on factors like the political and economic diversification, I'm focusing more on the economic diversification part. So if you are focusing more on the economic diversification part, and in South Asia, particularly in India, knowing the kind of leakage that happens, particularly when someone is in political office. So if your research question in a way can it be reframed as how better are the political families in terms of siphoning the public resources in order to diversify their own economic, you call it their assets or rent-seeking behavior, etc. So can it be reframed or can it be looked at through that angle as well? I'm Sushova. Sushova.
Now we can now decide that I'll go yes. And then that you will take all volume.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful session. So in your first slide, you as one of the trends you had personality also at the video, but towards your conclusion, I found it missing. So did you while doing your research, was it a conscious decision that you did not choose the variable of criminality within these families, or did you just lose the track of it? Or is it that these political families then have connections with criminal families, which is a lineage of criminals, and then they back?
My name is from University. So, what kinds of measures should be adopted for to decrease the dominance of family politics? At the same time, how we can increase the community participation to personal fair level?
Community participation.
So, community what may be surround the discrimination or the unrepresented people from the different how we can. Because of the lecture, actually we have a couple of times that I see. So I was reading a book on the backstage of democracy. So I have a question related to this is what Rahul Verma said. Okay. So what is last decade? We have seen the election campaigns in India have undergone a dramatic shift, right? Political parties increasingly rely on political consulting firms, takes and volunteers, professionals, data-driven insights, and online battles to mobilize voters. So we see the professionalization of politics in India. My question is how the middle class relates to this politics and how parties, mainly BJP, unexpectedly embrace this digital technology. What exactly is the driving these changes in the landscape of election? There's a demand and supply side factor.
demand from political parties to this box, and this supply side factor from youth who are quite interested in joining this. Why?
So let me start with the last question because it's not related to my work, but I can still sort of like say a couple of things. One, I think the book that you are reading by your book is really, really good. And this area, in fact, is going to be an interesting area of research for us. The sad part is political consultants at the moment don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. In fact, a couple of months back, I was at a conference of political consultants. Some of them definitely think they make politicians famous, and they have I think the image of Prashant Kishore in some ways has distorted our own perception of political consultants. Cannot have not. But if you read Amok's work carefully and you want to tie it to today's thought, Amok asks a very important question. Why did we start seeing rise of political consultants in the 2000s and not before this? And the argument he makes, among many other rise of middle class and middle class also not politics and maybe their participation was not the way. But the other point he made that lots of young age politicians got their education abroad and they all saw what kind of role these political consultants play. Now, joining today's conversation, who were some of the political people who were studying abroad? Right? These were second generation or third generation sons and daughters of politicians who were studying in different places, in US, in UK, and they saw the kind of roles political consultants were playing. And so political consultants are actually like what the first kind of breaks in this kind of environment where you have second generation or third generation politicians getting education abroad, seeing this kind of activity there, and they try to go play here. Okay, so for now, let's stop it here and we can talk more on political consultancy later on. I think, so let me pick Shivangi's question. Shivangi, I didn't forget about criminality. As a researcher, you have also present things which are clear. Too many moving parts make things very complicated. But we all understand, not just as social scientists, but human beings, that world is complicated. Right? And that's why in the beginning I gave you an example of what Mother want to work on. Right? Most of the political families, once they acquire that kind of empire, when I gave the description, I said the political families control a large patriot networks and have linkages with criminal organizations. I didn't call them I said criminal organizations. Right? Because that's also legitimate activity, not legitimate, but some kind of activity that happens in politics. So some of them actually don't need to be sort of like having that kind of political outlook, right? What is criminality in something? It's a reputation, right? If the first generation politician was a criminal and rose to politics, the son and daughter does not need to do that. They carry that reputation with them, right? And by that time, they have others to do that work for them, right? And so, in empirical analysis, this data analysis, I have done this for a shopping. I can't do that for QPL because there was no data on totality that exists. Since 2004, Election Commission now requires to file a certificate and you have to put your totality. So for the shorter time period, I have done that analysis. And I wanted to collect the data on the previous years. But so on certain things, when my sort of like students were calling people and asking, say ये पूछो कि अच्छा किसकी families they are related, they will tell you. But once you say, were they involved in any murder? Why are you calling time? So some kind of sensitive information was difficult to collect, and so we dropped that idea. But it's very much part of the entire sort of like conversation on that. Now, let me sort of like go to Ari's question, which is about sort of like diversification. So some questions are better answered through data. So I'm methodologically agnostic. I use all kinds of methods. You know, I have case study and application, right? I don't really delve into this qualitative quantitative divide. I think the question that you are asking can be better explored in a qualitative case study, right? Whether families are actually doing adversarial politics within themselves or being neutral. If I had just 30 minutes to talk about Muslim family, I would have given you whole details on within the Muslim family, right? For 10 years, there were two factions. Rashid Masood, the uncle, and Imran Masood, the nephew, were in two different parties. They fought against each other, right? But after 15 years of being sort of like in political wilderness, they decided to come together. And this happened through matrimonial alliance. Rashid Masood's granddaughter is married to now Imran Masood's son, right? And so, and in different states, these things actually play out very differently. If you go to Punjab, the political family strength is actually based on matrimonial alliance. Like the top three big families of Punjab, if you just drop two removed cousins, the Baras, the Supreme Father family, and the Patiala family are all related. Two cousins removed, you will get the whole. So all of this happens within families, right? As it used to happen in kids. Now, the question on patronage network, yes, politicians control patronage network everywhere, right? Like Northeast, South India, North India, and political families actually inherit those networks. So, the advantage that the sons and daughters of politicians are that they are not only carrying the name brand, they are carrying the network. That's why the title of this presentation was Networks of Power. They inherit the network or patronage network that was built by the earlier generation. There is going to be some differences in small constituency versus big constituency. But big picture argument that I'm making will apply to Northeast, will apply to South India, will apply to the context is going to change. The political economy that holds that network is going to change. In UP, in East UP, where I come from, you are not going to own complicated sugar factories, right? But in Maharashtra, you can do that. In Northeast, my own sense is a large number of political families basically like the greatest source is through government contracts, right? Because that's the sort of like economic pipeline which generates a lot of cash in that sense. Yes, Shashank, I think like one can reframe the question whether political families are much more likely to siphon off resources from sort of like public policy program. Like I didn't want to make a story of like like politics. Like the word like corruption has that's why I'm using the word red extraction. Right? I am very sort of like particular about when to use that visual. Right? Corruption becomes sort of like very colloquial way of thinking about how money gets sort of like cycled. Then extraction is basically usage of power to be able to draw and extract resources. So when the Muslim family is sort of like diversifying itself in city through construction contract is part of feedbacks, right? But I am not using the term for specific purposes because corruption in religion gets defined in different ways. How can we reduce the dominance of political families? Hard question. I will tell you, right? I can give you the nice sounding answers, which is that if you people like you go up and work in politics, then perhaps, but it's hard, right? Because at the core of this logic, what I'm trying to tell you is reproduction of power. Power tends to reproduce itself. Families are one way or safest way of reproducing power, right? So it's hard to sort of like completely reduce it, But if our political parties were more open, more competitive, right? Perhaps they will not rely on networks of families to run themselves, and maybe that's the way to go about it. But can we stop it? I don't know. Like it's very difficult that in every democracy we see this happening. In some, it's much more, right? Even economically advanced countries like Japan has very high percentage of dynasty families, right? Or US, just Google political families in US, it will give you a list like alphabet names. All it doesn't happen in US is that parties are not controlled by families, right? Like at the level of Congress women, you will find many more political families in US, right? So I don't know what the answer is. Maybe the book after this.
Yeah, I got you.
There was a suggestion how we can increase the participation of unrepresented parties.
You know the answer, right? How can we please participate? Right? Some questions, you know the answer.
Do we have any more hands? Yeah, please. You come and then I come. You and then you come.
Yes, sir. So now you have talked about the material of power. So my question was regarding the soft use of power, like legislation, authority. So they also, apart from being extractivist in terms of resource extraction, they also grow misproportionately, because there are cases where they also have to administer justice.
Yes.
So when people rather than going to police station, they go there. So there these networks and all that.
I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. And I will like very strong empirical analysis for the wonderful lecture. I'm Karthik Sahu and I'm pursuing Masters in Translation. As I'm from UP itself, and I have seen the whole now they're doing it. So I have seen this whole analysis on the ground, how the citizens and mining and other things work. So my question is the whole analysis work for the regional parties like SP, like Samajwadi Party, Uttar Pradesh and RJD in Bihar. But is it consistent for the organizational parties like BJP? And where the nepotism is not that strong. And how does the new parties like Muslim Army of Chandrasekhar Rajan, how does it fit in your analysis?
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I was thinking about this question that why there are families with the best political families, the political parties in my so I was wondering if past is the easy answer because Indian when democracy started, though there was a newer capital of people who fought for independence, but it still bans on older caste applications and the various social capital to come into power and use that to extract economic capital. And this class remains available to tapping in 70 years later, even after economic reforms. The class still stands to bring people into political power so as to extract. So this availability of concrete social capital is what differentiates this part of the world from the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. My question is, like, we were able to discuss that what things are on the ground, but I think we have another aspect, and that is what is being developed. And that is that why this dominance of the political community is being able to increase their signal. The answer to this question would be we have made in democratizing the democracy within the country. Also because of the lack of inter-party democracy. Okay. And second aspect, which can answer my question itself, is that is the political culture within the country being shaped in a way that people have implied the idea of power and politics very vaguely. So if it is because of that people are coming and voting for the
more powerful, or is it more like of inter-party industries in terms of how you use it?
So let me answer these and then okay, so Atinam and Ankit, I'll also like up your question and I'll try to answer it. One, see, I'm not trying to make an argument about why India has so many problems. Because it's everywhere. The way I think about problems is in a comparative sense, right? Which is why here, why not there? Why we had something 10 years ago, why we didn't have something? Because phenomena level questions require very different kind of thinking and very different kind of answer, and mostly they are not satisfying. Let me, while answering your questions, tell you why it's not satisfying. Now, I don't know what you think about caste and caste system, but to me, caste is a system of reproduction of power, right? Which is what I'm talking about, families also reproduction of power. I showed you an interaction between them, right? How is our caste producing its power? It's producing its power by capturing parties, by becoming political capital, right? Power basically finds its ways, its instruments to be able to reproduce itself. Now, democratizing the democracy point. Think about what we did in 17th or 74 Amendment Act. Basically, brought democracy to the lower level, right? We thought many more people will contest and democracy and governance will reach closer. What did powerful people in villages do with that? They captured them, right? Right? Even with 33 to 50% of reservation, your complaint is going to be most of the women who get elected are not running things, the male members are, right? So you try to bring some reform, but those who had power, they were able to sort of like curtail that reform. This is what happens in most systems, right? Which is that it's not easy to take away power from people who have. But I'm also not cynical or pessimistic that nothing can change, right? Just to give you an example, anyone who asks me this question of panchayat and different leaders, I tell them, watch the panchayat show on, right? Within, like, it is a 2-season or 1/3 season, is there? I don't know, it's in 2 seasons. In the first season, the women Sarpanch was very subtle. In the second season, she became more open. This is what is happening on the ground. In 30 years, now we have enough examples of independent women Sarpanches that are done. So change is slow, right? And why I'm able to say this with a little bit more confidence? Because of the global data set that I have. Over 75 years, 170 countries, what I am seeing is that in the beginning, when democracy starts, you will see rise in political families. And when democracy actually matures, families actually start declining. I might have that thing and just show you so that it doesn't remain as an hypothesis. This is what is happening. So I have polyarchy score, which is what media gives, right? Like at 0 level, you are basically a democracy. At this level, you are perfect democracy. Dynastic proportion, so it first increases and then it starts going down. So once you mature as a democracy, it will start going down at some point of time. But this all statistical work basically points to probabilistic nature. It cannot explain every case, right? US being a 200-year-old democracy, you still see dynasties. Some countries will be able to come out of that probabilistic nature, some countries won't be able to come out. That's another area of research. Why some countries were able to do that and some not able. Okay, I think that's a very important question. Sorry, I didn't throw your name on this list. Kavita. And I've been thinking about this. Don't have a good answer, but let me try. So, 2 short answers. One, the first generation politicians are much more likely to invest in what we call as soft power or legitimacy. Right? Think of Mulayam Singh or a Lalu Yadav. They have political family, right? But their next generation is carrying on the legacy or legitimacy they create. They are not just politicians. They are seen leaders of the social justice movement. Right? So they create, or I showed you that graph that local level, not everyone is a Saryada or Yadav. If you are a Chaudhary family in Saharanpur, how do you build your legitimacy? You do something on the ground there. You build streets and colleges for them. Right? In absence of state, like Miller National's book on criminality actually goes into this point. One, what do criminal politicians do and become so important? They mimic the state. They run the bar, they run sort of like justice system. And in fact, like I now wrote on a paper to understand the rise of Adhikari brothers in Bengal. Right? And I just want to sort of like leave you with this point, which is that sometimes things that we think are democratic can actually lead to very undemocratic outcome. Right? Sumetu Adhikari becomes what he becomes because of like he led a people's movement on the ground, the Nandigram Sindhu, right? And that gave rise to the Adhikari family. So people's movement created a family. Otherwise, they were a small time politician contesting municipal level elections. And now he's leader of the opposition in 15 years. And with 4 members of the family enacting politics and history of their happy memories. Karthik's question on I showed you the graph. It's not just about regional parties. This graph basically tells you here. I have both BJP and the Indian National Congress. Congress has more dynastic nominations compared to BJP, but we know BJP is more organized party in that sense. But this is not to say BJP does not have any dynasty. In fact, the long-term data to be indicates Congress is still more dynastic than BJP. But over a period of time, BJP is nominating more dynastic candidates. Right? The difference between Congress and BJP is that BJP at the top, at the moment, is not controlled by a single political family. Will it be the same? I don't know. Right? 10 years down the line, the Shah. Who knows? And Bihar is just beginning. It's like a single person party at the moment. Let's see how it emerges and then whether it follows the BSP route or the Republican Party of India route, who knows, right?
Also, we have examples like
that's what I said, like BJP also has, like, no party is like affected by this phenomenon. It's just levels are different. And levels may be different because the nature of parties. Right? CPM will have a big lesson because it's organized party and it's ideological party. So organized ideological parties are going to have fewer members from dynasty. That's a very clear sort of like.
So mostly it's answered, but I just wanted to ask when we do under politics, under parties, you can see that it's somewhat in Althusian's sense. It's ideological state apparatus, where it is being reproduced again and again. So that can be attributed to personalization of power, like what we have seen how Mulayam Singh, how the image and the legitimacy of Mulayam Singh was used. But do you think that there's also cultural meaning to it? So let's say when we talk about let's say take example of Europe. So Europe there's an important element of individualism that comes from the progressive ethic. And whereas that is not something which is present in countries like Japan and India, which you also took example, and the family is a unit, whereas in Europe it's the individuals. And that can also lead to this a cycle which is like an ideological state environment.
Sure. Yeah. See, each of the three. Does culture play a role? Definitely play a role. But is that the only explanation why we have so many political families? No. Right? As I said, I worry about comparative questions. Right? I am not worried about why India has so many political families. For me, the next question would be why Punjab has more and Tamil Nadu has less? Or why there is difference between Maharashtra and say next neighboring state, Telangana. there must be something going on in the sort of like nature of these states, the way local political economy is organized, that you are going to see something. So cultural exploration to me is only part of it, right? It can't explain the full spectrum, and especially not the comparative.
You will agree with me that Dr. Rahul Verma is on the top of the subject. I think that is what is most fascinating to me. Yeah, you want to ask? Sure. Go ahead.
Good evening. So I want to ask one question related to politics, political development in vision for movie. And because I had some paper on this, I just compared with North and South debates. Now, North and South development,
Northern states versus southern states.
yeah. And I read the book, written by James and Amber Hussain.
Okay.
And in that, I found that there is a vested political interest in keeping the region impoverished.
Okay.
Because when we look at the 75 and 24th Amendment Act, there is a lack of devolution, kind of lack of political will from the center and the state. Okay. In giving those autonomy to the region. To the rural in rural sense. So is there any political, is there any motive, Western motive?
No. There may be something. See, I think this idea that there are people who want to keep things underdeveloped, what it does not account for structural factors. Right? So, yes, there may be some political motives. Who am I to say there are no political? But in doing so, you forget about the structural factors, right? A good research should be able to take into account the structural factors, the political factors, the economic and geopolitical factors, right? To just give you an example, a friend of mine who works on Odisha and actually works on bureaucracy. So he collected data on transfers of bureaucrats, right? And not just transfers, because in government departments, say Professor Tripathi is transferred, he can move a petition saying that for XY reason, please cancel my transfer or send me to some other position. It is possible that the department accepts his request or rejects his request. This person was able to gather this data for Odisha Revenue Department for 8 years, and so some 370 transfers. What he actually shows through that is that the KBK region, the Kalahandi region, actually because of this transfers, so Dhananjay is transferred to Kalahandi and then puts a request, I will go to Kalahandi. And then his petition is accepted. So what happens? KBK is a poor region. Nobody wants to go there. Right? Why does nobody want to go there? Not because he will not make more money. Sometimes we all also think, yeah, they have to go to school. Kalahandi doesn't have a school. Right? No big reasons. Very small, sort of like, you can call it selfish, but good reasons. Why shouldn't, like, my wife, if she has a job, has to be here, right? And so what it has done over a period of time, the state presence in Kalahandi is good. Meaning you don't have officials to be able to implement welfare policies. So structures create vicious cycle for underdevelopment, right? The eastern part of UP had always been poor. And so there are structural reasons why it continue to remain poor. Political motive may be like plays a small part. See, corruption and rent extraction breeds in poverty and underdevelopment. Right? So it's not that even if people want to be corrupt, why are they less corrupt in some more developed places? It's not that they are different people culture. It's just the option to be corrupt is good. Rent seeking is created by structural conditions. So that was my answer.
We are not post-structural here. You see, I'm affecting very much. If this side of the audience will agree with me that we are doing I hope you agree with me
this side has also given you some very good questions.
No, absolutely. I enjoyed
Very proud of the students. They're very fine minds, and it's a very good sign. I think you have also given us an example of what a good research is. And research is always a work in progress. So one question leads to multiple questions. Many of us are from IR, international relations. We have been talking about a more South Asian IR. I think this which you thought that came to my mind was that, I remember 20 years ago, more than that, we had a political geographer from UK, Peter Jekeda, who came out with cities. We started looking at international relations from cities, major cities, and how they interact and circles of power. Listening to you, I was wondering whether we can also now think of political families as unit of analysis in international relations. Particularly, we were discussing this morning Oxford report on global inequalities. Then he said that now we have 1 trillion in the world, and there are going to be probably 2 more are going to be added. We have to remember all those slides that we saw today. And it clearly shows that the wealth, when you talk about global inequalities, are concentrated. So, how would international relations look like if we use this deploy this lens of powerful countries and I think that itself will open up a very new fascinating area for research. So thank you very much. Another major takeaway for me is that what very rightly said, the importance of methodological eclecticism. He said I don't want to be dogmatic in terms of my methodology. And I think you have also told us very rightly that let us not go from theory and set methodologies to our research questions. Rather, go from your curiosities, your questions, to go shopping as far as theoretical insights and methods are concerned. But at the end of the day, the most difficult part, I think, is getting your questions right. So thank you very, very much